Dobry din, greetings from Odessa on the shores of the Black Sea, and welcome to this week's Q&A or live stream. Drop your comments and your questions down below. So 3 events to look forward to this week with respect to the Russo-Ukrainian war. There are the trilateral negotiations going on at the moment between the US, Russia, and Ukraine. This is the first time that we've seen all 3 parties down, or most importantly, Ukraine and Russia directly talking to each other for many years. There are some rumors that they will try to organize a meeting between the 2 leaders, Vladimir Zelensky and Vladimir Putin, in the coming months. I would remain very skeptical. I have a position on this channel that the negotiations are going absolutely nowhere, and they are basically a charade until we see a significant change in the situation on the battlefield for one side or the other. There is little appetite to make the concessions from both sides' point of view in order to have some sort of peace agreement. Russia is effectively demanding a capitulation agreement, a medium to long-term capitulation of Ukraine, while Ukraine is demanding that Russia basically give up on its designs to pull Ukraine back into its sphere of influence and allow it to be independent. So that is something that just basically, it's the root cause of the war, to quote Vladimir Putin, is the fact that Kyiv does not want to be in Moscow's sphere of influence, in their orbit. It hasn't worked out very well for the last 20 or so years. Just look at Poland, which took a different course back in the 1990s, and where they are politically and economically compared to Ukraine. So that is the first, I guess, big thing coming up. On the battlefield, Russia continues to make very small incremental gains. The weather outside is pretty awful militarily if you're trying to advance. It's snow here. Here in Odessa, it's a lot milder than in the rest of the country. It's a few degrees warmer. Warm, bit of an oxymoron maybe to use in this context. It has been down to minus 20 degrees Celsius in parts of Ukraine in the last few weeks. There's snow on the ground, and it is pretty abysmal if you were trying to stay warm as a soldier near the front, for sure. Russia will continue with this change in strategy. They don't use so many armored vehicles anymore. It could just be an evolution of the tactics as drone warfare evolves quite quickly in the context of this Russo-Ukrainian war. The war looks very different the way it's fought now in 2026 compared to, say, the summer of 2023. And they are using less of these armored vehicles. It's also true that Russia has basically burned through the majority of their Soviet-era stocks in terms of armored vehicles that could be refurbished and used on the front. That was expected. I talked about it here on my channel to be in the second part of 2025 when they would really start to run low on those reserves, and that seems to be the case. So whether it's a combination of the drone warfare evolving with the fact that they don't actually have that many more stocks to burn through, Russian forces are not using so many armored vehicles. As a result, Ukraine loses more armored vehicles now than Russia does for the first time in the war, because Russia simply just makes their infantry walk or use horses or use scooters, or, yes, you heard right, they do use horses in some cases, and they try to advance that way. A lot of them try through stealth and in small groups so they can't be detected by the drones, but it is extremely costly. And the Ukrainians claim, for what it's worth, that the kill ratio, or the ratio of Ukrainian casualties versus Russian casualties, has gone very dramatically in favor of Ukraine, in the sense that now Russian forces are losing way more personnel per day than the Ukrainians are. This is different to what we saw earlier in the war, where because of the population difference, one metric to look at was the fact that Russia approximately had a population 3 times bigger at the beginning in 2022 than Ukraine, and that Ukraine really needed to have a casualty figure that was going to be more than 3 to 1, so 3 Russians for every Ukrainian, in order over the long term for this to play into their advantage in terms of the relative sizes. And Ukraine has been thereabouts by most calculations, probably a little bit less over the course of the war, maybe about 2.5 to 1. But now, with this change in tactics, Russian casualties have increased quite dramatically. They don't use the armored vehicles, which would have saved many of their personnel when they got hit in the past. And with that less protection, they seem to be taking more casualties. Russia, for the first time in the war, according to the Ukrainian side, is now losing more soldiers in terms of casualties than they recruit every month. So that's killed in action, wounded in action, missing in action, or maybe even deserters. And that is something that Russia will be forced into making a tough decision about. If they can't reverse it, sometime probably in the middle of 2026, they may have to go finally for another mobilization. They tried that back in the autumn of 2022. Had a very negative effect on Russian society. 1 million Russians actually left the country. I was in Kazakhstan at the time. There were lots of Russians who had fled first to Kazakhstan, planning to go elsewhere. So that is something to continue to observe. And I think just as the third thing to look out for is the general geopolitical climate. Last week, we had the unprecedented possibility of NATO troops basically shooting at each other in Greenland. Donald Trump was pretty gung-ho about annexing Greenland and other NATO allies, not just Denmark. Denmark actually sent some of their, I guess, limited special forces to the island with rules of engagement to fire on any troops that came there that were considered hostile. That would have been the US troops in that scenario, and some of their allies sent small limited numbers of troops to do exercises there, just small numbers, but also to throw into the mix that if Donald Trump tried to take Greenland by force, that they would almost certainly end up in a shooting match with the possibility of Danish, French, German, British personnel been injured or killed, and likewise on the American side. That would have changed the calculus of Donald Trump considering to take Greenland by force. We saw with the Maduro operation that when he managed to abduct the Venezuelan leader, that the US did not lose any soldier, but they had no killed in action, had a few wounded in action, reportedly, and no one, well, in the American and Western sphere, no one really cares too much about how many Venezuelans or Cubans advisors they had that were killed in that operation for domestic political support of the operation. But if you had that scenario where some American troops ended up dead, being killed by, say, Danish troops, and vice versa, you know, maybe Americans wouldn't kill French troops, it would have had huge political blowback on Donald Trump domestically. There was almost no domestic support for invading Greenland. It was very, very low. Maybe it was a little bit above single digits. That's just amongst the population. Also amongst the politicians, not much appetite to go invading Greenland. And definitely there was a lot of opposition from other parts of Europe, including Denmark itself in the population and the Danish population and their respective elected representatives. So it would have been an absolutely strategic mistake if he had gone and done that, but we don't know. Maybe he's going to change his mind and try and do it in a few weeks again. So we saw that play out, and that has had consumed a lot of the global attention, especially around the Davos forum that took place, the World Economic Forum, in the past week, as opposed to concentrating on what's happening here in Ukraine and the Russo-Ukrainian war. And we've seen since then, Mark Carney, the Canadian leader, made a quite, I think, landmark speech at Davos where he described the rule-based order as basically a thing of the past, you know, the limited and partial application of a rules-based order, and now we're entering a new era in global affairs. And Donald Trump slapped 100% tariffs, or is threatened to, just like he threatened to tariff European imports into the United States when he was having a spat about Greenland. So definitely keep your eye on the broader geopolitical ramifications of principally the White House and what extreme measures they may take in the next week or so that might change the balance. Some of it plays in Ukraine's favor in the war, like the decision to seize ships that are part of Russia's shadow fleet, which is basically the way that they export a lot of their oil, for example, in violation of sanctions, and other things like having a huge diplomatic spat with NATO allies. And then he also, Donald Trump, basically insulted the NATO allies who come to America's aid when U.S. invoked Article 5 of NATO back after the 9/11 attacks by saying that they weren't on the front lines, they won't come and defend us. It was caused a huge issue, I think, for a lot of the Trump-aligned parties in Europe. I think most of the big ones all condemned what he said, and that's a first. They've been cozying up to Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, been aligned with them, especially you see in the UK with Nigel Farage, for example, and basically for the first time he had to come out and criticize Donald Trump because it was kind of something that he couldn't get around or find a way out of, because it was just so outrageous what Donald Trump said. Donald Trump kind of walked it back a little bit in the meantime, giving them an out to claim, oh, he's now made a good statement about how the Brits were always helpful, but the damage has been done. And this is something that, in terms of the Trump strategy, in terms of international relations, it's going to have long-term, extremely negative effects for the US in terms of getting value from its alliances or even maintaining its alliances, because if they keep insulting and taking actions that are against their allies, then allies start to look elsewhere. And we've seen that with the Canadians signing a trade agreement with China, not because Canada and, say, America's U.S. allies, European allies, U.S.'s European allies actually want to be ideologically closer to China. It's just that because the U.S. is so unreliable as an ally under Donald Trump, that they need to balance their exposure and look for other opportunities. We see Mercosur, the agreement signed there, although now it's going to have a legal challenge, so a legal review, so it's probably going to be postponed by about 18 to 24 months. However, we see other parts of the world look to make alliances, or at least partial alliances, or have better relations with America's main stated economic competitor, which is China. So all of this doesn't play out well for the long term, but we're focused on the next week. Just keep an eye out. Donald Trump, he's a master at marketing and keeping the American population's attention away from the Epstein files. He has done very successfully because hardly anyone talks about them, even though only a tiny, minuscule percentage of the documents were actually ever released. And they were under legal obligation to release them all, as far as I can understand, weeks ago. So leave it at that. Drop your comments and your questions down below, and have a terrific Sunday. I'm going to have a live stream, a very important one, I think, on the main lifestyle channel in a few hours. I haven't fixed what time I'll have it. I may actually have it a little bit later to allow people on the west coast of the US to tune into it live. I always have it way too early for that part of my audience. So I will see you later on. And Slava Ukraini, Rom Slava, do Перемоги.